Jack Bobo, always a pleasure. Thank you for being on Food Truths. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too.
I'm going to jump right in, and I think we've known each other a long time, and worked in similar and slightly different areas of food production. And um, what I admire about you, and I think our listeners would be very keen to hear, is you have a very interesting background. You know, you're a lawyer by training, but you also have a degree in environmental science as well. And you have worked in and around food policy, food production, and like branding and marketing and messaging of new food products and conventional products for decades at this point. And you've sort of seen it all from government to industry to academia, where you currently are serving as the executive director at the Rothman Family Institute at UCLA. Um, I'm deeply curious about like sort of what's put you on this path and what keeps you on it, most importantly.
Yeah, so I sort of come to food, I wouldn't say reluctantly, but surprisingly. Uh, my early days, I was in Indiana, and I grew up with a family garden, and it was pretty big. We had corn and peppers and cantaloupes and watermelons and strawberries and green beans and onions, and we basically were self-sufficient. It was all organic, not because of a philosophical belief, but because we had child labor, which was me and my brothers. And I have to say, I did not enjoy too many of those days. So, so I'm not the sort of person who comes to agriculture because of this deep passion for getting their hands dirty and working in the fields. It was mostly to escape it that I went to university. Um, but when I finished my undergraduate studies, I took a detour. I went into the Peace Corps. I was a science teacher in Mikambo, Gabon. And Gabon, for those who don't know, is on the west coast of Africa, right where the equator runs into the continent. So I spent 2 years really living in the jungle, working with the community as a science teacher. And when I got back, I decided to go to graduate school because I was really committed to how do we save the rainforest? How do we ensure that sort of nature doesn't get destroyed as we try to expand uh, into those areas? And so I studied environmental science, as you mentioned, and law. And I ended up working at the State Department. And I had hoped to work in the Office of Environment and International Science, but instead I ended up in the Economic Bureau in the Office of Food Policy. And I quickly realized that uh, all of the challenges that the Environment Bureau was facing were often caused by agriculture. So they did deforestation, but they didn't do agriculture, which causes 80% of deforestation. And, they did freshwater, but 70% of all freshwater is used for agriculture and all of these issues. And I sort of came to the realization that you can't build walls high enough to keep people from going in and cutting down the forest, nor should you. If we can sustainably and nutritiously feed people, the rest will take care of itself. And so I sort of found that, I much preferred protecting people in order to protect the forest instead of protecting the forest from people.
And so, how did that connect to your sort of policy positions that you've developed over your career? Like, you've had all these experiences, and I think I hear a sort of pragmatic sort of approach in there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but how did that inform sort of how you approach policy and food policy today?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, it all really built out of my time at the State Department. My first few years, I was doing Africa food policy, then Asia food policy, then Europe food policy, then I ran our global biotechnology program. And my last few years, my only job was giving speeches. So I had a unlimited travel budget, could travel anywhere in the world and just talk about the future of food, the role of science, and how to better communicate and engage with the public. And it was really during that time that I realized that science at the beginning of the conversation just polarized the audiences. Those who agreed with me agreed more, but those who disagreed actually disagreed more. And so I went back to my undergraduate roots and started reading about cognitive psychology and behavioral science and marketing and advertising because I wanted to understand, how do people come to believe what they believe and know what they know, and when do people change their minds? So this completely changed how I thought about food, how I thought about science, and how I communicated about it, because I realized that People often want to tell people the answer, but nobody likes to be told what to do, but we all want to do better. And so how do you communicate in a way that like excites people and delights them and gets them motivated to take action rather than creating even greater barriers and divides between people that make solutions harder to achieve?
I'm sure you're familiar with Dan Kahan, and I think he's at Yale. He's an economist, right? You probably and his research on motivated reasoning and food decisions and climate decisions. And when I was at FDA, I used that as well as to like understand, like you were, the notion of why do people make the decisions they make. And I think the surprising thing, like you suggest, is that when you confront someone with evidence against their position, and if it happens to be a core belief for them, they won't change their mind. They dig in further
Mm.
to their entrenched belief position. You move them further away from where you want them to go. Um, and in food, it's even harder to crack that nut. Um, and I guess that gets to sort of like, you started, you have this company, Futurity, and you've worked for very famous like biotech companies and food tech companies. How has your experience in working with these groups and others influenced like your thoughts on against maybe combating motivated reasoning? How do we get people to understand and vote, or like vote with their dollars in favor of what they should be doing, rather than voting against their food interests?
Yeah, I was literally talking about the work of Dan Kahan last night over dinner with my daughter, talking about cultural cognition and some of his early research. So,
Of course you
uh,
were. Of course you were.
yeah, well, I think you're putting your finger on it that, we often talk about things that just things in ways that just make everything harder. And, I've worked with a lot of the alternative protein companies and their CEOs. And one of the things that I tell them is most people won't buy your product because they believe what you believe. They will buy it in spite of it. So you actually need to get your personal beliefs out of the way of them enjoying your product. And so, we often think that you need to change somebody's mind to change their behavior. But the reality is, it's often easier to change somebody's behavior than it is to change their minds for the reason you just said. As soon as somebody tries to convince me of something, I'm going to argue against it. On the other hand, if somebody says, try this, it's going to be amazing, you're like, yeah, that sounds good. I love amazing stuff. And if it is amazing, well, now all of a sudden they're the sort of person who eats plant-based, or they're the sort of person who likes beans and lentils, or they're the sort of person who eats cultivated meat because you've given them an experience that they enjoy. And you didn't try to convince them of the technology, you didn't try to convince them of the science, you didn't try to convince them of climate change. You just presented something that they could appreciate.
So the benefits then are just sort of an externality. They're baked in, but you're not choosing it for that particular reason. And behind that suggests that the real game in food and like alternative proteins or whatever, if you're trying to compete in food, is you need to build a superior product. It needs to taste good. It needs to compete on the values that price, like availability. Um, why do
I
you
think,
think we're seeing? Well, go
well,
ahead, please.
well, yeah, I would just say, that's essential, but not sufficient.
Hmm.
Because the food companies themselves often they will then talk about it in a way that then turns off that consumer, right? So they've made a great product, but then they alienate the very person, that they want to try it. And, again, it's because they think they need to convince them philosophically. And, it's often just it's not the case, and it's often counterproductive. And the reality is, even if you convinced me that, let's say, that I shouldn't eat meat, it doesn't mean that I won't eat meat. You've just convinced me that it's a bad thing to do. You know, Almost everybody knows we should be eating 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, but 90% of people don't do it. So the fact that we believe something doesn't mean our behaviors have changed. And so, it's the behaviors ultimately that, we're trying to influence. And so why get stuck on the hard part instead of just moving forward on the easier part?
Yeah, you anticipated my question, which was like, if all this is true, why aren't we seeing, these alt protein companies, or just in general, why are we not seeing the needle shift more significantly on, what is it, eight, depending on how you do, eight, nine, 10 out of people on the planet routinely eat meat and have for over 1 million years? Why aren't we seeing that shift to five out of 10 and seeing more plant-based diets, despite the fact that we have good products in that particular category?
Well,
And
I
you're
mean, I
saying
think
it's
I think it's a few things. I mean, certainly how it's communicated, mostly by plant-based companies these days, um, are alienating those consumers. They're telling them to stop eating meat instead of just delivering a product that they enjoy, but they're also just how they market it. How many times have you heard that, um, as soon as plant-based is cheaper than a hamburger is the day we win the war? Well, I don't think that those companies understand human psychology and they don't understand economics, and which is a bad combination because you never want to talk about, you don't want to use the language of cheapness. So think about a Godiva chocolate or something, or Rocher. Um, it's an affordable luxury. They will never say it's cheap. Buy it. And so you don't want to use the language of cheapness, particularly when your product is more expensive, right? So, you're basically saying, hey, we're going to be a commodity, but we need you to pay more for us today. And so on the economic side, well, hamburger is a byproduct of steak. As long as there's the same amount of steak in the world, there will always be the same amount of hamburger in the world. They'll give it away before they'll pay to send it to a landfill. So you don't want to get to a race to the bottom with a byproduct. You will lose. And so, there's often how they're thinking about it. They're marketing these products as healthier when, many of them are not. And the reality is, when I eat a burger, I am not looking for the healthiest choice. I may be looking for the least healthy choice. So again, marketing these products as healthier actually makes people enjoy them less. I mean, we know that if and there's examples like from soup when, Campbell Soup reduced the sodium in their soup and they put, low sodium on the can, people said they didn't like it as much, even though in blind taste tests, people could not tell the difference. But if they put it on the can, people experienced it as not being as good. And so, that psychology is really important that if we don't expect something to be good, even if it's good, we won't enjoy it. And so, how these products are marketed, they're actually marketed in a way that it tells me I'm not going to enjoy it instead of, the signals of pleasure that we want and expect in our food that are indulgences.
so taking that advice for someone starting these companies or food companies that exist today that are trying to crack this nut. It sounds like part of this would your advice be, or counsel be, to these companies to focus less on how great your technology is that you produced it, and more competing on these sort of, what I'll call, sort of very just basic and common sense approaches to food, like sensory experience, affordable luxuriness, like guilty indulgence, whatever. Pick your thing. But I'm curious what you would, kind of advice you would give to them based off of this.
Well, certainly you want to send signals that people are going to enjoy the product. You're not going to want to use language that will undermine the value of your product. This is why Impossible Foods created the indulgent burger. And, they wanted people to think of it and say, okay, this is going to be amazing. But it also has a secondary benefit because if I call it the indulgent burger and you say, hey, it's ultra processed, you kind of just smile and nod and say, yeah, that's what makes it amazing, right? Because now all of a sudden, don't eat three of them. It's bad for you, but it's so great, and because, a hamburger isn't trying to defend that it's the healthiest product in the world because that's not why the consumer is eating it. And so we miss some of those things. Also, a lot of these alternative protein companies, technology companies, they love their technology more than the consumer ever will. And so we see that in how they talk about it, how they market it. So I'll give you two examples. Uh, there are two companies that produce protein bars made from insect protein. So on one hand, you've got the Cricket bar, And you know it's a cricket bar, not just because it's called a cricket bar, but because there's an illustration of a cricket right there on the label. No doubt about it, you are eating bugs. And the other is the jungle bar. And in tiny lettering that's very hard to read, it says insect powered. Well, the people who try things first are innovators and early adopters. They are fine eating bugs because they want to eat stuff that nobody else eats and they want to be the first to do it. But guess what? 95% of consumers do not want to eat bugs. And so the cricket bar, it may appeal to the innovator and the early adopter, but it's very hard to see how it scales to the rest of society. On the other hand, that jungle bar allows us to ignore the fact that it's made from insects if we like it. Like it gives us permission to forget that detail. And we know that this is important because consumers read labels, but they don't read labels on unhealthy products because they don't want to know how unhealthy they are, right? And so, you need to work with human psychology, not fight it.
How then do you? 'Cause I agree with that. How do you reconcile that with, we the animals that we eat, as you know, is just a small subset of the total animal biomass, or animal variety on this planet. And the ones that we've chosen to eat, you know, you could argue are also just as unfamiliar as insects. And I'm, again, not to defend or deny that. How then is it just sort of like norming the fact that it's just normal? It's a convention, a cultural convention that we've been eating them, that they're okay, and we wouldn't adopt a new thing. I guess what maybe the different way of saying this is, what are the factors that get us over the threshold to adopting that new species or food type or whatever, and in general for a new product?
Yeah, so I mean, so much of it is cultural, and many societies eat insects. They're totally fine with it. They have no disgust reaction. However, in many Western economies, we do have that sense of disgust when we understand it. And so part of it is putting it in the context of something that we're familiar with and that we're okay with. And, that's part of having it as a protein bar and marketing it as a super protein. All of a sudden, we see it in a different light. And over time, if we're eating insect protein bars, we may come to think, well, insects are a pretty amazing source of protein. And over time, we actually just stop having that disgust reaction, and that product could be okay. The science is pretty clear that if I present you with a product often enough, eventually you will try it. And if you try it often enough, you will like it. So, tons of research on this, showing that familiarity will eventually lead to liking and get you over that hump. And so, that familiarity is part of what you're trying to do. And, culture means that you already have that familiarity with many products.
And do you think that because of that familiarity, like for example, you and I both worked with the conventional meat industry in various capacities. You've worked with USDA extensively as well, and other foreign governments. Do you think what have they figured out that maybe others have not, or maybe don't have to deal with? Are there any intrinsic parts of the system that they benefit from in terms of marketing? Like they have a product that effectively sells itself. I could imagine. But they've also built, for example, their distribution systems are sophisticated and very good. But I'm curious what you think, maybe from a philosophical point of view or marketing or branding, that conventional meat industries has figured out that maybe others should learn from and or adopt.
Well, certainly they're leaning into things that consumers already like and people are happy with. And so, they have that advantage of how people already think about these products. Um, they're not trying to be something they're not. So, they also it's a little bit easier. Many of the alternative protein products are trying to present themselves as something different than what they are, as opposed to introducing the consumer to beans and lentils and just making them amazing and they are what they are. And so I think that, when we think about the future of protein, some of it is going to be mimicking some of the products that are out there, but some of it's going to be developing entirely new products. And I don't think the alternative protein sector and some of the plant-based and others have spent that much time trying to create entirely new categories that consumers don't have any sense of. But one of the downsides of the current system is that, they're mostly commodities. And if you're a commodity, it's hard to grow in terms of percent. You can grow in terms of volume, but it's hard to double or triple or something. And we see this challenge most today in the dairy sector. And so, many in the dairy sector, well, many in the alternative dairy sector would say that, they're responsible for Americans drinking dramatically less milk today than per capita than we did in 1980. But the data from USDA shows pretty clearly that the single biggest driver of reduction in milk consumption in America is bottled water. And you don't have any dairy companies out there fighting big water. They're all fighting the alternative dairy companies because they're saying they're the ones who are doing it. And so, we end up, having these confrontations between some of the new startups in alternative dairy and the traditional section because of the narratives, the stories that are being told. And those stories are counterproductive to being able to use, you know, oat milk or, or cheese or butter or something in the naming because they feel like they're under attack from these categories and they feel like they could go out of business because of these categories even though those categories are not driving the change. And guess what? Dairy consumption in America is at an all-time high because we're eating a lot more cheese. So the biggest reason we're just drinking less milk is because consumers are trying new stuff. We like diversity in our diets and our choices. And that's probably going to be one of the big factors when it comes to Americans, eating more alternative proteins and other things is over time we like to try new stuff, and so maybe we don't have a steak. Once a month we have something else, or maybe we don't eat two hamburgers a week. We eat one and we eat something else. Uh, I think just providing choices will eventually lead to behaviors changing, and you're never going to get you know millions of people buying a single type of plant-based burger every week. It's really going to be that diversity that makes the biggest change.
Well, there's that's super interesting. There's two parts I want to follow up on that. One, of course, is like always the perennial, what's it going to take for alternative proteins? And I've been on record talking about how I don't like the term alternative. It just literally marginalizes the products immediately. But alternative proteins to become protein, just protein, mainstream protein. But more importantly, I think related to that is, and you brought this up around the boogeyman to the dairy industry is plant milk, when in reality, it's the Goliath that is bottled water. And when I know you, when we both worked in federal agencies, one of the classic cases that's taught is the margarine wars in the butter industry, and how much FDA had to fight that, and the sort of preemptive banning that went through, and the protectionism. And now we're seeing that with like cultivated meat, for example, where there are, in my opinion, protectionist practices in the state of Florida to proactively ban a product that's not even available. I'm curious, how do these two concepts relate, if at all, in terms of like making alternative proteins mainstream, and also the sort of, I guess, inherent fear or like boogeyman looking, or the scapegoating that we see, or attempted scapegoating in these industries too. Is there anything that reconciles that?
Well, I would say one is, don't create the battles that you then have to fight. So the alternative dairy, is bringing down the wrath of the dairy industry on themselves, and they're encouraging the alternative protein companies to do exactly the same thing. They're saying, look, we need to, you need to learn lessons on how to drive them out of business, and I think that's mostly just counterproductive. The reality is that the global protein market today is 1.5, $2 trillion, and it's pretty much an animal protein market. And it's going to grow to, maybe $3 trillion or more by 2050. Well, you know, we really don't want to add another 40 billion animals to the planet because the environmental consequences would be devastating. And so there's this huge global market, that's worth at least $1 trillion for alternative proteins to capture. And you know what? That future is actually better for the livestock sector than the one where livestock expands. And I know that might be hard to believe, but it's really just a supply and demand question. If the demand for real meat doubles and the supply of real meat is flat, livestock producers have to be making twice as much money. And so, the future that's best for alternative protein companies is exactly the same future that is best for the livestock sector. And nobody's talking about things like that.
Hmm. Well, then, um, so it sounds like then there's this one. There's got to be a maybe a level setting and like reality, like where we are really at in terms of meat demand, what have you. I also think that there's a notion of finding common ground with incumbents that I personally and when I was with Upside Foods believed in as well. That there has to be a you have to work with the existing system and find ways to improve what you can and sort of take your lumps where you have to. Um, do you think that well, one, do you think incumbents within the industry like they know how to get along with each other, the giant food CPGs, or is that itself a shadow war that we're unaware of? Or do you think mainly it's, for example, these emerging technologies and food products that haven't yet learned how to sort of quote unquote play the game?
Yeah, I think it's the latter because, there, as you said, there isn't that much tension between the beef sector and the poultry sector. Even though the single biggest driver of reduction in beef consumption in America is expansion of poultry. We eat a little more animal protein today than we did in 1980, but we eat a lot less beef and a lot more poultry, and we eat about the same amount of pork. And so, why is it that the beef sector is focused on alternative protein when it's the chickens that are eating their lunch? And it's because of how they view the competition. The poultry sector is not marketing itself as better than beef. It's not saying our goal is to drive the beef producers out of business. So none of those signals are coming that they're the enemy. And as a result, they're totally fine with those people. And so there's a lot of really good lessons on how to communicate, with the incumbents. But I also think, there are just understanding how the game is played and the system works. I often hear that oh the um, that these well that the incumbent companies that the ag sector is trying to crush alternative protein and that the sector is united against them. But the reality is that the agriculture sector, is very segmented itself. And there are, organizations that disagree on what the future should look like. And so understanding who your allies are, who your partners are, if I were to ask the pork industry, what is the single biggest obstacle to your success? They're not going to say alternative proteins. They're not going to say beef. They're not going to say poultry. They're going to say biofuels. Biofuels is the single biggest thorn in the side of the pork industry. And that's because America sends a third of its corn supply to biofuels, which dramatically increases the cost of animal feed, which increases the price of production of pork. And so, you know, they're really focused on biofuels policy, and in the end, it actually serves as a bit of a meat tax in America. Meat prices in America are significantly higher because of biofuels. And has anybody ever had that conversation? Nobody's telling Americans, you're paying more because of biofuels. And that's because the sectors don't see themselves as enemies, and so they're not talking about it.
Hmm. Um, so the what do you think then is or would you say that the public enemy number one for some of these alternative proteins and these emerging food technologies isn't necessarily incumbents, but it is themselves getting in their own way, or do you think there's other factors at play? I assume there are multiple factors, but I'm curious what you think about what it. I'm trying to get at what it would take to actually see one or more of these industries and or companies really take off beyond sort of just a fraction of the market.
Yeah, yeah, a lot has to do with how it's presented to the consumer. And I think that there was one of the benefits that Impossible Foods has is that or had was that it was originally introduced in high-end restaurants that positioned the product as something to aspire to. And you know, think about that high-end restaurants that were often serving sort of farm to table and organic and all of these things were also serving the Impossible Burger, which was ultra processed and a GMO. And not a single consumer cared about those two things at places that you would normally not even find those things on the menu. And part of it is that it's that positioning. It was positioned as a premium product that consumers aspire to. It was the only place in town that you could get it. And so people wanted it and they were willing to spend $20, $30, for a burger in order to have it. And so that's why sort of the marketing, you have a great product, but then you also have to market it in a way that people aspire to. And because they're often talking about the environment, they're talking about sustainability, they're talking about healthfulness, you know, it just isn't, they haven't been marketed in a way that, consumers are just going to want and love. And so I think it will take products that are marketed more like traditional foods in the sense of sort of understanding consumer psychology. And, I don't think many of the companies have done that from the beginning. Like I said, Impossible has made a 180-degree turn in the last year, and I think that's helpful. You see all of these signals that are important. So, for example, the Impossible Burger, the packaging in the grocery store, has red lettering and red packaging and things like that. Beyond has green. Well, we know that the red packaging signals, um, meat, it signals health, it signals tasty, and all of these things, whereas the green signals this will be healthy and you're not going to like it. Buy me. And and so, companies need to think through just how do you actually market food to consumers, and what does the consumer you're trying to influence care about, not the consumer you don't care about, which is why, and Beyond is marketing to consumers who will never buy their product. Vegans who don't want products that are imitating meat because they don't want to eat meat versus those who, you know, want to eat meat every day.
So we have, obviously food professionals listen to this show, but a lot of people are just sort of motivated consumers. Um, and we talk about, you mentioned ultra processed. I'm curious because I know you probably already know the answer to this, but for people listening, how would you define sort of the degrees of processing moving up to ultra processed? And because we say that word, I don't think a lot of people know, and I feel like it's debated somewhat. But what ultra processing is to you, and then lesser degrees if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, I certainly don't spend a lot of my time sort of focused on ultra processed foods because I do think the history of the term is problematic and that it's not that informative. But as you know, it really goes back to the Nova classification in Brazil and sort of this effort to try to distinguish foods based on their level of processing. Though
Hmm.
at its origins was also this thought that not only were the food companies processing food to make them tastier and more desirable, but also because they were trying to undermine the health of the consumer to force them to keep coming back and gain weight. And so there was a philosophical aspect to it that has mostly dropped out by now. But, there's unprocessed foods, which are, the raw ingredients. There's minimally processed, which might include cutting and cooking or heating. And then, you have sort of the middle ground of something that might just be canned with, salt as a preservative. And then anything really beyond that starts to get into the category that they would describe as ultra processed. That could be, you know, 5 or more ingredients. It could be um, having ingredients that are not commonly found in somebody's home. Uh, but there's no sort of clear definition across different communities as to what that might be. And there's no explanation of what aspect of processing might lead to the obesity epidemic that we absolutely do have.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And to people listening, it is well known, and just if you make food, like all food is processed. There's some degree you don't eat. It's very rare that you would eat something straight out of the ground, and you definitely don't just eat an animal as is. You have to prepare what we would call preparation or cooking, or as you said, sort of like chopping or break. Like those are degrees of processing. Bread is a processed food. You have to process the wheat to get to a usable format to make something like bread. Um, and I mean, I think of ultra processing in terms of, and I agree, there's no agreed upon definition as well, is like the degree of shelf stability at ambient temperatures, basically, like and or refrigeration temperatures, basically nothing, anything beyond frozen, like things that have to be maintained on a shelf, and the degree of like you said, sort of single, highly refined single ingredients that are used to perform a specific function in the food. The classic example that we've used throughout human history is salt. We use table salt to preserve our foods and extend their shelf life, and that is processing. Um, and I also agree that there is an increasing, but like still debated amount of evidence that suggests the specific functions of specific ingredients in those products that would contribute to the degree, like what would, is it a negative and adverse outcome towards human health in an ultra processed, quote unquote, ultra processed food. um I suspect we'll have some clearance on this, or some clarity I should say. um and I feel like you'd be well positioned also. This is a nice segue to talk about, um I'd love to learn a little bit more about like what you're doing over at UCLA at the Rothman Family Institute, and like, is this something you'd be concerned with, and what are you working with over there? Because I'm sure you're working on a wide variety of issues.
Yeah, so at the Rothman Family Institute for Food Studies, I joined the university last month, and so I'm the first executive director of this new institute. Amy Rowett is the faculty director, and she works on cultivated meat and other research in more of that biopharmaceutical side. But I think that at the university, does all sorts of things related to food. And at the Food Institute, part of our job is to connect all that research across the university so we can scale the impact of the work we're already doing. So you've got the Semel Healthy Campus Initiative that's, globally recognized for its work on reducing obesity through engagement programs. You have tons of research that's happening at the medical school. You've got the Resnick Center for Food Law and Policy at the law school. So you have all of these different places where interesting things are happening in psychology and social sciences and others, consumer insights. And if we can bring more of this work together, we can better understand the challenges we face and we can come up with even better solutions. So that's really our job, is how do we connect the research, scale the impact, and then the other piece is that I kind of serve as an ambassador for that research to the world in order to communicate it, to enhance thought leadership and reputation, participate in global dialogue so that people can learn about the work that we're doing. But I would say the thing that I'm most excited about and the thing I'm really spending my time on is what can we do to de-escalate this tension in our food system? Because right now, the way we talk about these issues often makes everything harder. The way people communicate is actually polarizing the audience. Making it, they're creating barriers to progress. And so, what I want to do is I want to look at behavioral science and cognitive psychology and marketing and advertising and all of these things and say, is there a better way of communicating that could bring people together to actually get things done? And that's what sort of my biggest hope and ambition is for this program, is that we can be that place to de-escalate that tension.
I think this is super cool and a really cool initiative, and I agree. I also think that uh, the folks at UCLA are looking ahead and going, how can we basically become an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary entity on food systems? Amy Rowett, Professor Amy Rowett, is also like this basically be a brilliant biomechanical engineer, and she's moved into cultivated meat. What other fields do you think are going to have to be brought in? It sounds like to a greater extent we need more Dan Kahans in this area, like like yourself, these economics professors. But I'm curious what you think needs to be brought in to help understand this system and make better foods for more people.
Well, I'm mostly focused on that social sciences side of it because, I feel like there are people like you, there are people like Amy, there are others that are out there looking at the food science and food technology side, and there's only so much I can do to help them. On the other hand, how we talk about it will determine. So it doesn't matter if you have solutions if nobody will eat them. It doesn't matter if you have solutions if nobody will invest in them. And this I was in Washington, D.C. last week, and it's interesting because everybody was saying, well, we need more government investment. We need policies and regulations that are fit for purpose. As you and I know, transparent, predictable, and science-based is critical in order to attract investment and in order for government to invest. But if the public not only accepted innovation and new technology, but demanded it, well, then the government would invest. If the public demanded new innovations, the regulations would ensure that they come to market and people would invest in it, right? So we're spending almost none of our resources on being able to better communicate, and yet better communication will ensure that everything else just flows. It kind of goes back to my, belief in a sustainable and nutritious food system will allow the environmental consequences to take care of themselves. In the same way, if everybody was pulling together in the same direction and agreed on what we needed to do, we would do it.
Implies a very interesting dichotomy because I agree. But how do you reconcile that with, people don't know what they don't like? I think Steve Jobs said this famously, like with product development. How do you encourage people to want these things, these new products and innovations, when they don't know generally? And I agree, people don't generally know what they want. I don't think you can. A lot of people can't imagine a color that doesn't exist, but we clearly do it. So what's the solution there?
Yeah, yeah, I think Jobs said that, he didn't do any consumer surveys because how would the public know what they wanted until they saw it? And I think that's part of the problem with so many consumer surveys today. Somebody goes out and does a survey, would you eat cultivated meat? And some percentage of people say no, and some percentage say they would never eat it. Well, you know what? What percentage of people said they would never buy an electric vehicle 15 years ago? It's probably some enormous number of people who drive EVs today. And think about how EVs were sold. So, I mean, yes, the cost has come down dramatically. So the cost of the battery in a Tesla today cost about $12,000. A battery with that storage capacity in 1990 cost $1 million. So innovation was absolutely critical to making that happen. But the cost came down because the scale went up of sales. And the scale went up because instead of trying to convince me to buy, a Nissan Leaf or a Volt that, was not the kind of car that rich people would aspire to. And guess what? It cost a lot of money for something that I didn't really want. You know, Elon Musk came along and said, I'm going to give you a luxury car that's going to be a better experience than the car you've had before, and you're going to love it. And guess what? Rich people are like, yeah, that sounds amazing. And because of that scale, the cost came down dramatically and more people could afford the car. So like we're doing things backwards. Like we're trying to come up with, the cheapest product. But, if I wanted people to like cultivated meat, I would be selling it for, $150 a hamburger in some high-end restaurant and have lines around the corner to be, for people to be the first to be able to try it. And yet nobody's really doing that. They're not creating that ultra luxury experience to products that are more expensive. And just an example, I was working with SIP, which is the International Potato Research out of Peru, and they were saying that we don't have enough. We wanted to go into Costco, but Costco said we don't have enough volume of these heirloom potato varieties in order to sell into Costco. And I'm thinking, okay, so you don't have enough potatoes to be a commodity. So that sounds like you've got an ultra premium product. So why not turn it into individual varieties of vodka, with these heirloom varieties that you produce locally and you maintain all the manufacturing and you do the value added. And now all of a sudden, instead of selling potatoes by the ton, you're selling potatoes by the liter and you're capturing 90% of the value instead of 5% of the value. And so, we're often just thinking about these markets in a way that, you know, isn't as useful as it could be.
Do you think they like consumers could get on board? Because I mean, I think consumers always want to, again, they're used to commodity price and they're used to have things available. This idea of creating sort of luxury products in the food space isn't new, and definitely has been considered by a lot. Why do you think that would work? Or like, do you think consumers would just cater to the ultra luxury, the rich on these products, and it eventually trickle out like the Tesla model did? Or do you use what you learn to sustain your business to build a cheaper, more high volume product? Is that the strategy?
Well, I think there are a variety of strategies that could work. I gave the one example with, the insect protein, that there are two clear paths that are going to make it more likely to come to market. The other is understanding who needs to bring a product to market. We haven't talked about that yet. So
Mm.
imagine for a moment that Monsanto had created the Impossible Burger. I think we know it would have failed. And every newspaper in the world would have said it failed because the consumer will never buy a GMO burger. Well, everybody would agree on what went wrong, but of course that isn't true because the public is totally fine with a GMO burger. So the reason we think things fail and the reason they fail are often different. And it's hard to understand that difference uh, and anticipate it. So many of these alternative protein companies are very nervous about whether they're GMO or ultra processed or other things. And with the right product positioning, nobody cares. And it's because you're not a large multinational company that's the real difference. So the reason Monsanto couldn't do it is because they're a large multinational company and they didn't have that trust. And so, but nobody would be talking about that. And understanding, again, who brings it to market. We often say big food companies can't innovate. And if you read the Harvard Business Review, it would say they can't innovate because they're large, they're slow, they're risk averse, and indecisive. Okay, those things could all be true, and their products still fail. And here's an example. When Quaker Oats came up with Quaker Oat beverage, put it in the stores, they know how to do product research, they knew how to do consumer marketing, they can dump a ton of money, and it totally failed. Well, why would it fail when it has to be probably a pretty decent product? Well, it failed because innovators and early adopters walk into the grocery store, they see Quaker Oat beverage, and they think, my God, could there be a more boring product? And then they turn around, they see Oatly, and they think, oh my God, they're making milk from oats. Mind blown. Because innovators and early adopters are the people who try new stuff, and the people who try new stuff never drink or never consume big food products. They're looking for edgy new brands. And so the people who love Quaker Oats are sort of your average person. Well, they don't try new things until the market has proven them as valuable. So they're not going to buy oat milk until it's been around for a year or two or three. And so Quaker Oats was just too early to the game in order to be successful. And so, again, who brings it to market is also part of this entire narrative. And what do they stand for, and how does the consumer view them? And I think, too many companies just, again, don't understand what goes right and what goes wrong and why it goes right or wrong.
Hmm. Okay. Um, I always ask this. So I'm going to ask you what what are some just food myths that you just want to put to bed? Things that just your hot take, you just it just drives you crazy that people believe this in their daily lives, daily purchases, whatever. But if you could change the minds of every consumer right now on your pet issue, what would it be?
Well, I mean, I think it's a little bit difficult, because many people say that consumers don't understand science or they don't like science. I always say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And for me, it's to help the public to be able to frame innovation as something that's good in their lives. And I don't see that as the problem of the consumer. I see that as the problem of the marketer, the company itself. We're failing the consumer is not failing us.
Yeah, I definitely in the alt protein space, we're struggling as well with how to message these new products. My I think like my perennial, I will say my perennial hot take is that MSG is delicious and should be in everything. Um, and so I don't know if you have anything else other than on the food side. Well, if you're listening here and you're thinking about starting a company, you heard it from Jack Bobo. Like, serve your find your product market fit first. Um, well, listen, I do want to learn a little bit more about the availability bias and the snob effect. And I would say, like, you write extensively about why we fear our foods and innovation. I think this goes to what you're saying: innovation and fear of change. How would you connect those two concepts briefly to listeners? And like what they would mean in terms of, because I find them the most interesting things you've written so far about this topic.
So you said the availability heuristic and what was the
your
other?
your availability bias and the snob effect that
Ah,
you've written separately about.
right, right. Well, the snob effect, I think, does go to some of these ideas that you know, nobody cared that Impossible Foods was ultra processed and a GMO when it was $20 a burger and founding farmers in DC. But as soon as it went into 18,000 Burger Kings, people pushed back on it being ultra processed. Right? And so as soon as poor people could afford it, the relationship to the consumer changed. And so companies need to anticipate those types of things so that they don't have to shift their branding and marketing and other things. And so, so that's part of just understanding, like, when do people want something and when do they not want something? Um, the availability heuristic, is just a complicated way of saying what things come to mind when I say a word. So, like, when I say the word natural, are you thinking rainbows, butterflies, and puppies, or are you thinking salmonella, E. coli, and listeria? Because they're all natural too. And the mind just goes to a happy place when we hear the word natural. And so understanding how our minds lead us astray is really, really important, because if we don't understand our own biases, it's actually very difficult to talk to other people about theirs. And so we need to get a handle on our own confirmation bias. We're all really good at seeing bias in other people, and we're really bad about seeing it in ourselves. So the more self awareness we have, the better these conversations will go.
Mr. Jack Bobo, thank you as always. It is always an interesting conversation with you, and I really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts. So thank you again.
Always a pleasure.
Where can we find you if people want to contact you? What's the best way?
Sure. So they can reach me at the university at jbobo at college.ucla.edu, or they can find me on LinkedIn, and always happy to chat with people.
Wonderful.